Good morning, everyone. We are learning Mishna Harah. I dedicate this morning's learning in memory of my mother, Mrs. Shlomis Rabinowitz, Shlomis Bas Rabbi Yaakov Eliezer. And we are up to Parak Dalet, chapter 4, Mishnah Ches, Mishnah 8. Okay, so quick introduction, and that is that when Joshua, conquered the land of Israel, that sanctified it. After the destruction of the first Beis HaMikdash, or the first temple, that sanctity went off. And then later on, when Ezra came back to and eventually rebuilt the second temple, he reconquered areas of Eretz Yisrael, but not all of the ones that at one time Yoshua had conquered. And that second sanctity that came about with Ezra's conquering is a sanctity that continued through the times of the Mishnah, and that relates to our Mishnayos because we're talking about the obligation of Challah. Challah is an obligation in Eretz Yisrael that outside of Eretz Yisrael. Outside of Eretz Yisrael, it's a rabbinic obligation. The question is, what exactly are the borders of Eretz Yisrael in the sense of what we're discussing right now? You've got the lands that were originally conquered by Yoshua, which had a sanctity, and that sanctity went off. Certain areas were reconquered by Ezra, and therefore they are back to full sanctity, but the areas that he did not conquer are not back to their sanctity. And then you have lands that were never conquered by either of them. And this is going to make a difference as to how we deal with the obligation of Challah. Now, nowadays, present days, being that the majority of the Jewish people are not living in Eretz Yisrael right now, therefore the obligation for Challah, even in Eretz Yisrael, is rabbinic in nature. However, the Challah of Eretz Yisrael is treated differently than the Challah of outside of Eretz Yisrael, even though they're both essentially rabbinic, because of the fact that in Eretz Yisrael, at one point of time, it was a Torah obligation. And therefore, we'll see there are going to be differences. So now, Mishnah Ches, from Gamliel says, Shalosh aratzos l'Challah. There are three lands when it comes to separating Challah. Me'eretz Yisrael ba'ad Kaziv, from what would be known of Eretz Yisrael at that time until a city called Kaziv, which means it was a land that was reconquered by Ezra. You separate, you separate one portion of the dough of Challah, one portion of the dough is Challah, and you give it to the Kohen. And you give to the Kohen the amounts that were mentioned before, 1/24th if we're talking about a private person, 1/48th like a person who bakes the dough, who's breaking the bread to sell. It's got to be eaten in a state of purity. Okay. Now, just for some clarification, hope you're able to see this. This is going to be tough. Okay. So in this picture, as you see, there are different shades. And the darker shade is the area that was reconquered by Ezra. And you'll notice that actually the border goes up. And that's because actually you'll find described that the area that is up to a place called Akko is actually the border of the land of Israel. But there was a strip of land that was reconquered between Akko and Kaziv, which is why we say the northernmost part is Kaziv. Okay? Now, so we say in those areas, one Challah. Miksiv ad Nahar ad Amana, if you go from Ksiv up to the river and up to Amana, and we'll revert back to the picture. Okay. If you go from Ksiv to the river, it's not clear which river exactly it's referring to, but to a river, which is to the east, and then Ksiv to a place called Amana, which was a mountain area. That is to the west. Okay. So basically, if you go, when you're dealing with those areas, okay, you're dealing with those areas, which is here and here, okay. One second, please. Okay. All right. But we have the one area that is considered the land of Eretz Yisrael fully. Now we're going to have another area, Ksiv ad Nahar, these areas that I showed you from Ksiv east to the river, from Ksiv west to Amana. There, when it comes to the mitzvah of separating challah, shtei chalas, we got to separate two portions of challah. The Mishnah tells us achas la'ur, one of them is going to be burned, the achas la'kohen, one of them is going to go to the kohen. Now, we mentioned yesterday that once you are outside of Eretz Yisrael proper, there was a decree that the land becomes, or that just going into the land makes you tamei. Since they would bury their dead not necessarily in cemeteries, the sages instituted that basically walking into the airspace of these lands makes you tamei. Now, and any challah that's separated there automatically becomes tamei and can't be eaten, has to be burned. So really, when you're in this area outside of Eretz Yisrael, you separate challah, it automatically becomes tamei. There's nothing you can do about it, and that really should be it. However, the sages were concerned with the following, especially in this area that we're talking about right now, which is from Ksiv up to the river and to Abana, that these are areas that actually at one time were the land of Israel. And because they were at one time the land of Israel, people are not aware that, these were the areas that were conquered by Yeshua, but not reconquered by Ezra. And because of the fact that at one point of time it did belong to the land of Israel, people don't realize that these areas also have that decree that the airspace makes you tamei, makes you impure. So when they go ahead and they see that you would separate a challah, a portion of challah, and then burn it, then they would think that challah that is pure can be burned, because they don't realize that this challah is impure, because they don't realize that decree of impurity is extending to this area that was once part of Eretz Yisrael. Therefore, the sages were concerned that they're going to see people burning the challah, not understanding why. They're going to think that you can burn challah that's pure, which you cannot. Challah that's pure has to go to the kohen, not allowed to destroy it. Therefore, the sages instituted that in this area, you're going to go ahead and separate two portions for challah. One portion is going to be burned because it's tamei. The other portion, which isn't really challah, you're going to give it to the kohen. The purpose of giving it to the kohen is that, giving it to the kohen is not why the kohen can eat it, because it's not really challah. This separation, this second separating of challah they instituted, which were treating it like challah because you're giving it to the kohen, was to make people realize, hey, you took challah and you burnt it before, and now you're giving a second challah to the kohen. Why are you doing that? Wasn't the first one challah? And they're going to realize there's something going on. Either going to figure it out or going to ask for clarification. And then it's going to be clarified to them. The first one was the real one. And because it became tamei, it has to be burned. Because the decree of the tuma of the decree of impurity for lands outside of Eretz Yisrael applies to this area also. And therefore everything will be clear. But we want you to make a separate challah to give to the kohen, again, which isn't really challah, but we're treating it like challah in regards to giving it to the kohen, because we want people to realize there's something going on here and not to make any kind of mistakes. Now, Mishnah continues that in this area, shal ur yesh lashir v'shal kayin ein lashir. The one that's burnt has to have the minimum amount, while the one that goes to the kohen does not. Meaning, there are two separations of truma here. We know that the separation of truma has to be at least 1/48th, 1/24th, whatever it may be. Now, you have to, do you have to give that amount for both of these separations of challah? The Mishnah says no, only one. Which one? The one that resembles a challah from the Torah the most. The first challah, right, is the challah that actually, again, it was challah that was part at one point from Eretz Yisrael. It becomes impure and needs to be burned. And therefore, it is the one that is most similar to a challah of the Torah. Therefore, it has to be the one that the amount is, you have to take off the amount from that one. So even though it's going to be given to the Kohen is anything you want, any amount you want, and the large amount is going to get burned, but we're doing that because of the fact that the first one, being that it was separated in a land that was at one time Eretz Yisrael, and again, it's going to be burned because of the fact that it's Tameh, so it resembles a challah that was a separation of challah that was obligated from the Torah. Therefore, it gets treated so, and the amount that of the minimum amount has to be given for that challah. What you give to the Kohen in order to make sure that people don't get confused, that doesn't have the minimum amount. That can be whatever amount you want. Okay, so that is the second area, right? So we have a first area where Eretz Yisrael, reconquered by Ezra, full-fledged Eretz Yisrael, one separation of challah. Why? Because there's no impurity there in the airspace. It's challah that's tahar, give it to the Kohen, everything's fine. When you get to the second area, which is the area that is not fully Eretz Yisrael, it was once Eretz Yisrael, but it's not Eretz Yisrael anymore. Therefore, the impurity of lands of outside of Eretz Yisrael applies there. There we have to go ahead and give two. Now, min hanar umin amana v'lifnim, from the river and from Amana and inwards, which really means the area in between them, east to west, that was never part of Eretz Yisrael ever. Below that was part of Eretz Yisrael, parts reconquered, part not reconquered. But then you have the area that's above that, never part of Eretz Yisrael. Interesting, we don't discuss south here. We seem to be discussing north. Okay, now, so what happens there? Shtei chalas, you're separating two chalas. Achas l'ur v'achas l'kohen. One goes to be burned, one goes to the Kohen. Shel ur ein lo shir, the one that gets burned has no minimum amount. Shel kohen yesh lo shir, and which goes to the Kohen does have the minimum amount. Now what's happening here is like this. Here, it's unquestionably, everybody knows it's outside of Eretz Yisrael. And everybody knows that there's an impurity here, and therefore a challah that's separated becomes tamei, it can't be eaten. But the Chachamim, the sages, were concerned that if this happens, then people living here are going to forget there's such a thing as challah going to a Kohen. And therefore, they instituted here two separations of challah. One is a separation of challah because it's impure, it's going to be burned. And then a separate separating of another separation of challah given to the Kohen, which again, it's all rabbinic in nature. And therefore, the rabbi said, although we are in the land outside of Eretz Yisrael where everything becomes tamei, the Kohen can still eat it because that's not, so to speak, the real truma, or it's an extra truma for precautionary measures. That one is going to go to the Kohen. He's going to eat it so that people realize challah goes to a Kohen. Here, though, the minimum amounts are switched around. Being that in this case, whichever challah you're separating is totally rabbinic in nature, it has no connection or resemblance to a challah that has to be separated according to Torah law, because this area was never Eretz Yisrael. Therefore, when they instituted two challahs, they said that the one that is tamei, we're not gonna make. You don't need to give that amount there. It's this again. Don't forget, this is rabbinic, and this is rabbinic challah. This is challah only obligated to separate according to rabbinic law. And they said in this case, you don't need the minimum amount, or that's going to be burned. Better that the one that the Kohen gets the larger amount. Meaning we don't want to not have a challah here that doesn't have the minimum amount, because we want people to realize the challah has a minimum amount. But in this case, where we're completely outside of Eretz Yisrael and everything is completely rabbinic in nature, so there they said, okay, the burned one, any amount. The larger amount might as well go to the Kohen and he should be able to eat it. And therefore here, it switches. Once we're totally outside of Eretz Yisrael, the one that gets burned, the person that gets burned can be labeled less than the minimum amount, while what we give to the Kohen to make sure that people realize how it goes to a Kohen it has to be at least the minimum amount. Now, Utvul Yoim Eichla. A Tvul Yoim can eat this. Now, what it means like this. A Tvul Yoim is a person who has gone to the mikveh because of the fact that he, let's say, came into contact with something impure, and he goes to the mikveh, And very often a person waits to go to the mikveh, and for the rest of the day, even they went to the mikveh, for the rest of the day, they still have a status of somewhat impurity until the evening when they become completely pure. Now, there are different types of impurity. You've got impurities that come externally. You come into contact with a dead sheretz, one of the dead rodents that the Torah says makes you tamei if you come into contact with it when it's dead. And then there's certain bodily discharges that make you impure. Now, according to this opinion of our Mishnah, at this point, we're going to see that if we're talking about a purity, so we have two portions of challah here. We're discussing the area of the challah that's completely outside of Eretz Yisrael. The challah that's completely outside of Eretz Yisrael, there's going to be a certain leniency. And leniency is going to be that although typically truma or challah cannot be eaten by a person who's called a tful yom, a person who went to the mikveh, but has to wait till the day is over to become pure, that person cannot eat truma or challah. In the case of the challah from completely outside of Eretz Yisrael, areas that were never part of Eretz Yisrael, where we have two separations of challah, and the first one is being burned, actually, the first one, which does become tamei because it's outside of Eretz Yisrael, so it's in tamei airspace, and it becomes tamei, which we say gets burned. Actually, if we're talking about a person who is a tful yom, that means he had the bodily discharge, but he went to the mikveh, he actually can eat it. He can actually eat this challah. The challah that we say that gets burned is only getting burned, again, completely outside of Eretz Yisrael, because there's no one there that could eat it. But if there be a kohen there that could eat it, either because he does not become tamei from his bodily discharge, or because he already went to the mikveh for that, and he actually can't eat regular, and in Eretz Yisrael, he wouldn't be able to be eating the challah. But in the case of this challah that's complete from completely outside of Eretz Yisrael, he would be able to eat it. And once we have a kohen who's able to eat it, then we don't have to do two separations of challah. You do one separation, the kohen eats it, that's all you got to do. If you don't have any kohen like that, you have a kohen who had the bodily discharge, but he didn't go to the mikveh. He can't eat this challah, even though that challah is going to be burned. He can't eat it. Well, if he can't eat it, and there's no one else to eat it, we say that then you got to separate two. You got to separate one challah to be burned, and second challah to be given to a kohen. The second challah, that challah to make sure that people don't forget that a kohen eats challah, he can be tamei for that. He could have had bodily discharge. He didn't go to the mikveh, that he could eat that. That's not an issue. But it's the first one that gets burned, which we're really, giving it we're giving it a treatment like regular challah. There, and we say, okay, depending on what the situation is, you may not have to separate two challahs. If there's a kohen there that could eat it, then we say give it to him, and you don't have to do both. Rabbi Yossi says, nope. Even for that portion that would be burned, he does not need to go to the mikveh, and he can eat it even in that kind of state of purity, even if the purity comes from a bodily discharge. Now, the Mishnah reverts back to the opinion of the Tanakhama, who now tells us that who are the people that we say would not be able to eat from this first truma that would be burned otherwise. And we say as a tful yoim, once they go to the mikveh, they could eat before they had not. So that includes va'asura lezavim lezavos lanida v'layoldes. Refers to people again who have these bodily discharges. One of them not mentioned is a person who has a seminal discharge. A zav is a man who has a similar to something that comes out of him similar to semen, but it's not that. And again, that makes him impure. A zava, we said zava first, but let's get a nida. Nida is someone who menstruates. And after her 7 days of menstruating, she needs to go to the mikveh. According to Torah law, 7 days is enough. She stops bleeding after the 7 days. Then you have a zava who bleeds further after that period of her first 7 days of her cycle. And that makes her impure and possibly even impure again, even if she went to the mikveh. Uliodas, to a woman who gave birth. All these people are impure from a bodily discharge. They all have a certain process that they go through of becoming pure, such as going to the mikvah and then bringing sacrifices. And the Tanakama, meaning the first opinion before Rabbi Yossi, who said that a tvul yoim, when it goes to the mikvah, just needs to wait for the night to become pure, could eat. And if he didn't go to the mikvah, he can't eat. He says includes all these people, and including a person who has a seminal discharge, that until they go to the mikvah, they would not be able to eat from this. Rabbi Yossi, on the other hand, who before said doesn't need tefillah, which was going on what's called the balkari, the person with the seminal discharge, would disagree with all these other ones also and say all these other ones could eat it also. Which means, according to Rabbi Yossi, it's very possible that this whole double portion of challah may not always be that relevant, because you really have a lot of other examples. You really have a lot of people, basically anybody who's tummy would be able to eat it. And that's possible that according to Rabbi Yossi, there really is no need for separating two challahs. Now again, when we talk about this challah of outside of Eretz Yisrael, we're going to see that there are certain leniencies that apply there. So for instance, just to read a quick introduction, challah of Eretz Yisrael is subject to a number of restrictions. A Kohen may not eat challah of Eretz Yisrael on a table where a non-Kohen is eating, out of concern that the non-Kohen may end up eating the challah. It is also forbidden to give the challah of Eretz Yisrael to a Kohen who is not careful to observe the practice of eating chulin only in the conditions of tahara. Meaning, there are people who would only even eat non-sanctified food in a state of purity, only in a state of purity, even though there's no prohibition of eating regular foods, not in a state of impurity. They still were stricter, and they said they only eat foods in a state of purity. And typically, if a Kohen isn't careful like that, we're not going to let him have challah, because challah, for sure, he's forbidden to allow challah to become impure. The Mishnah explains that these prohibitions do not apply to the Kohen's portion of challah outside Eretz Yisrael. The portion that the Kohen gets outside of Eretz Yisrael doesn't have these laws, and therefore the Mishnah concludes, it can be eaten with a non-Kohen at the same table. It can be given to any Kohen, even a Kohen who is not careful to eat his non-sanctified foods in a state of purity. Okay, we're now in the laws of Lashon Harah, Klal Yud, chapter 10, Sif Tesvav, paragraph 15. Sorry, one. We're up to 16. From all this we were discussing until now about how careful you have to be about telling other people about what someone did to you, we can see that there's something we can focus on, something that people constantly make a mistake with. Because let's say you'll see a person who's speaking Lashon Harah about someone else. So you go over to the person and say, why are you speaking Lashon Harah about the person? Take your shivlacha. His immediate response will be, he spoke Lashon Harah about me. That is a typical scenario. Somebody speaking Lashon Harah, Reuben speaking Lashon Harah about Shimon. Levi says to Shimon, Reuben speaking Lashon about Shimon. Levi says to Reuben, why are you saying Lashon about Shimon? So Reuben says, because Shimon said Lashon about me. Okay, because that's a big mistake. They comment on it for many reasons. Okay, now how does he know? What's his claim is Shimon spoke Lashon about me. How do you know? Because so and so told me. Okay, so Echad, first mistake. When you first heard, meaning going back to Reuben, when Reuben heard from those people that Shimon spoke Lashon Hara about him, he wasn't allowed to accept that. That's called rechilas. Rechilas is the word you use, as we will soon be using it very often, is when you tell someone what someone else did to them. Not just telling someone did something wrong, but someone did something wrong to you. Now, if that is your basis to speak Lashon Hara about the person who spoke Lashon Hara about you, that means you accepted rechilas from the people who told you about it, which you're not allowed to do. So you for sure can't, on that basis, go tell other people about it. And even more, let's say it's true that he spoke about you. It still doesn't permit you to go afterwards and speak Lashon Harah, because if there is no constructive purpose in it and you're just getting back at him, that is absolute Lashon Harah. And therefore, people are very quick to make this mistake to speak Lashon about others who they were made aware of by others that person spoke Lashon Harah about them. Have a wonderful day, a wonderful Shabbos.